I don't know if this has ever happened to you before, but when I go play golf at Friendly Meadows, close to Bethel, I go down 32 and go through Batavia, and I take little highway 222, and it's a narrow kind of two-lane road, and I'm driving down there, and I'm kind of lost, and all of a sudden I come to my senses, and I think, oh my goodness, how long have I been unconscious? You know, how did I even stay on the road? I don't know how I haven't wrecked all these big vehicles and trucks coming by me. And it kind of scared me. And I guess I was just driving subconsciously. And I don't know, maybe my subconscious is better than my conscious, but I'd kind of like to know what I'm doing. And I left here the other day and went to Glen Estes Withamsville and turned right, and there's that little Thomas More school right there. And I'm driving, and all of a sudden I see that there's a police car stopped and on the left-hand lane coming towards me, and there's all these cars behind it, and I'm a little nervous, like, am I supposed to be driving or stopping? And I slowed down, and there's cars behind me. I just stopped. And I thought, I wonder what I'm doing here. And then all these cars started coming out of Thomas More School, and I guess that police officer had stopped to let all the cars out, and I was pretty proud of myself. I thought, well, I figured it out. Sometimes it's good to be paying attention. And then sure enough, after they all got out, I started going, and the cop flashed his lights at me and gave me a little, hey, I felt like an honorary police officer. You know, I was sure glad I paid attention that time. And, you know, as we go through life, we just don't want to go through unconscious. We don't want to go through without paying attention. You're going to miss something very important. And I know that's why you're here. And that's why we're digging into the scriptures. And that's partly why we've been studying the Gospel of John, to let Jesus tell us what's important. What are the things that we need to pay attention to? So if you have your Bibles, turn to John. We're going to actually be in John chapter 7, John chapter 8, but I'm going to start in John chapter 7 because I'm skipping it. I'm going to come back to it next spring when I finish John. We're not going to go through all of John, and it'll be a great summary because 7 in some ways summarizes 5 and 6. And Jesus has been teaching about who he is, if you remember, in chapter 5 and 6. And then in chapter 7, verse 12, it says, and then there was much muttering about him, that's Jesus, among the people, while some said he is a good man, others said no, he's leading the people astray. Yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. And then jump down to verse 40. So when they heard these words, some of the people said, well, this really is the prophet. And others said, well, this is the Christ. But some said, is the Christ to come from Galilee? And then in verse 43, so there was a division among the people over him, and some of them wanted to arrest him, but no one laid hands on him. So 7 is sort of a climax, because Jesus has been teaching about who he is, and some of them are saying, hey, hang on, are you claiming to be the Son of God? Are you claiming to be equal with God? And he continues to teach about who he is, and people start saying, well, who is he? And that's a lot of what John is it's teaching us through the words of Jesus about who Jesus is. But when you get to 8, there's a little bit of a shift. And instead of these teachings about who Jesus is, instead of the crowds being curious about who Jesus is, you see sort of a confrontation against Jesus starting to develop. But you also get some clarity finally about what Jesus is here to do and what his mission is. And so as we start today in John chapter 8, we're going to get a little bit of clarity about who Jesus is. Now, let me tell you a little bit about John chapter 8. We're going to start off here with the story of the woman caught in adultery that Jesus lets go. We're going to read this. And just so you know, most of you have a footnote that says that this story isn't included in most of the oldest manuscripts, and that's true. So why is it in almost all the Bibles that I can buy or pick up? Well, part of the reason is the early church. You can go back to Augustine of Hippo or Ambrose of Milan back in the early 300s, middle 300s, and they both thought it belonged there. And they thought it belonged right here where it is in our Bible. In fact, Augustine says that the reason it's not there is some of the people were worried that it showed a leniency towards adultery, so they took it out. I don't know if that's true. But I will tell you this story of Jesus is in so many texts, in so many different regions and locations, and it was accepted as an authentic story by almost the whole church. And so we have a lot of confidence this happened. It's certainly consistent with the character and teaching of Jesus. And so that's why we're going to read this today, and it's going to be a part of our story. And what we're going to study today certainly doesn't depend on this story, but Jesus is going to clarify his actions with his teachings. So listen for a moment as we read John chapter 8, verses 1 through 11.
But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such woman. But what do you say?" This they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones. And Jesus was left alone with a woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more."
So as we get to this passage, Jesus starts letting us know why he's really here. And I don't think that there's going to be anything more important in some ways than what we talk about today. And look at the end of verse 4. So they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" And this they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Now, you have to understand that, first of all, there's a couple weird things here. There's supposed to be, according to the law, a trial. I don't know if there was a trial or not. They said they caught her in the act. It sounds like they caught her in the act and just brought her to Jesus, said what we do, and maybe those were the witnesses. But there's another problem. If you read very carefully in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, it says that both the man and the woman should be stoned. They only brought him the woman. So there looks like there's some hypocrisy going on here. I don't know exactly what all is going on. But they said this, or John says they did this to test him. Now, why is it a test? Here's why it's a test. Well, first, they're out to get Jesus. Confrontation is starting, but everyone knows that under the Roman rule of law, that the Jews could not carry out a stoning or a capital offense. That's why they couldn't condemn Jesus to death. They had to take him to Pilate and ask the Romans to crucify him or kill him, because the Jews were not allowed to carry out capital punishments under Roman law. So they're putting him here in a little bit of a vice. The law says to stone her, but what are you going to say? And it's kind of a no-win situation. If you say you aren't stoning her, then you're admitting you're not going to follow the law. If you say you're going to stone her, you're going to be in trouble, because the Romans are going to come get you and arrest you because you can't do it. It's just a trick. But then, of course, we see what Jesus does here. It says that Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. No one knows what he was writing. Some people have suggested he was writing out the 10 Commandments. Who knows? And that would fit, and as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Now, when you look at this story, here's what we are reminded, is that all of us are guilty of sin. It's kind of what our Lord's Supper talk was about. Bill said, he emailed me and said, "I need to find out if I ought to line this up with your sermon." I said, "No, you can do whatever you want." It just happens it lined up perfectly. Everybody sins. The difference here is one got caught and the others didn't. One is forced to confess, the others are actually hiding it. But they left, beginning with the oldest, because let's be honest about it. If we're honest with ourselves, the older we are, the more time we've had to sin. Unless we're perfect, we've probably sinned more than most people. And so they knew they were guilty. They were just hiding it. It reminds me when I was in my first ministry at Mountain Avenue Church of Christ in Tucson, Arizona. I was a campus minister. The preacher was let go, and so for a while I preached for a pretty long time until they hired a preacher, and they asked me, "Do you want to preach?" I said, "No, I want to keep doing campus ministry." I was converting people left and right. I thought that was my calling. But I remember during that period when I was preaching, an older lady caught me at the back one day and said, I need to tell you something. I said, well, I was a little bit afraid of her. I said, "Well, what do you need to tell me?" And she said, "Well, you're not preaching enough about sin and hell. And I want you to preach some more about sin and hell." Well, I was kind of shook up. I never was afraid too much, and that sometimes was to my own detriment. But so I was trying to figure out what to respond. And I said, "Well, let me ask you a question. What sins do you struggle with?" I'm thinking, why did I say that? You know, that was not the right answer, the right question. But what was more interesting was her answer. "Well, I don't struggle with sin anymore." And I thought, well, what about anger and judgment? Because I was feeling pretty judged at the time, and she seemed really angry. You know, the worst type of sin, and this is why sin is so dangerous, is when we sin and can't see it, or we sin and we think we're just fine. And you think about all the things that they argue about with Jesus, about healings on the Sabbath and different things, and think about all the things that church people argue about, the things that they divide about, the things different denominations argue about. Well, Jesus doesn't talk about a lot of those things, because Jesus goes to the most important thing, and it's sin, and there's a sin problem, and that's why Jesus has come. Now, you know, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but I've seen this T-shirt on one of our members here for a long time, and every time I see it, I just kind of chuckle. Because it's one that Donald Dunn wears, and it says, "Fish more and worry less." And if you haven't seen it, you're going to see why I chuckle every time I see it, because I had him send me a picture of it during the week. Here it is. He's not worried at all. Never mind that a shark is just about to devour him. And I think this is sort of the motto of the world, is do whatever you want to do and just don't worry about it. The problem is worry and fear. Just be positive and enjoy your own life. And little do we know that because of the sin problem, there's something about to devour us. Now, so here was the problem, though, is some of these Jews, and especially the Pharisees and the leaders, had this false confidence and what we'll call a false freedom. So look at chapter 8, verse 31 through 33. So Jesus said to the Jews who had believed him, "If you abide in my word, you're truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And when they answered him, "Well, we're the offspring of Abraham and have never been enslaved to anyone. How is it that you say you will come free?" Now, they have a short memory. They forgot about Egypt. And the Romans now are somehow enslaving them in a way. But they say that we're free because of our connection to Abraham. And then in verse 38, he says, "I speak of what I have seen with my father, and you do what you have heard from your father." And then in verse 39, he answers again. Well, they answered him, "Abraham is our Father. So the issue here is they were putting confidence in their lineage and connection to Abraham. And yeah, because they had the law and because they were the chosen people of God, but they had confidence in the wrong things. They had confidence in a false sort of freedom. It's a false confidence. And that's what Jesus is going to tell them. And I made a list here of some things that sometimes we have false confidence in. Sometimes we put our confidence in our religious heritage. And some people go, well, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and my great-great-grandfather were all members of this religious heritage. And they had to be right. They were really smart. I may not be able to tell you everything they did, but I have my confidence in them rather than having your confidence in Jesus Christ. Or some people have their confidence in their own morality. Well, I'm a good person. I don't lie. I don't cheat. I don't think God's going to treat bad people in an unfair way, and they have confidence in themselves. Or some people have their confidence in their religious activity. And they think, well, I go to church, I give to the poor, I volunteer at a lot of other organizations, and they have their confidence in their religious activity because of what they do rather than what was done for them. Or some people have their confidence in having the right doctrines. And I don't know where they come up with the list. It was probably passed on to them. But they got this list of 10 things. And if you believe these things, you're okay. And you know what? That's all right. And some of those may be right. Maybe they're all right. But faith is not just intellectual. It's also emotional and spiritual. It's not enough to have the intellectual beliefs if you aren't living the life that goes with it. Or some people have their confidence in a spiritual experience, and they had this one moment, or maybe it was something that they thought was just from God. And I know some people like that they aren't even living like a Christian, but they have all this confidence because they had this huge dream one time, and they know it came from God. And so a spiritual experience, or maybe it was the time you came to the Lord, or God used you one time, but it's not a one-time event. Following Jesus is a lifetime journey. Or maybe it's comparison with others. Well, I got to be okay. I'm better than all these people. Or self-sufficiency, thinking, well, I can take care of my own problems. I believed in God, and I'll take care of the rest of it. Or cultural Christianity, where people look like a Christian, they sound like a Christian, they can recite Christian beliefs, but they're just not following Jesus. And so Jesus is going to indict them for having a false confidence and false freedoms. And so look here in verse 39, in the second part, Jesus said to them, well, if you were Abraham's children, you would be doing the works Abraham did. I can tell by what you do. But now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth that I heard from God. This is not what Abraham did. You're doing the works your father did. And they said to him, we were not born of sexual immorality. We have one Father, even God. And he said, well, if God were your father, and he goes on to say, you'd love me or you'd listen to me. So basically, they were deceived. Look at verse 44. And it says, you're of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. And when he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he's a liar and the father of lies. Now, here's what we know, right? We know that Satan is a liar from the very beginning with Adam and Eve. He lied to them. He deceived them. They were enticed by the fruit. It looked good to the eyes. He promised them it would be some sort of experience that would open their eyes. He said, you won't die, you're going to live forever. And so Satan lies to us, he deceives us, and he tells us you can do this and it's not going to affect your salvation. And so they were deceived by this. But here's what happens. When you fall into deception, you end up in the sin trap. Look at what Jesus says in chapter 8, verse 34. He says, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. Now, here's how this works. It's not everyone who sins, because we'd all be in trouble. It's not a one-time event, but I'm going to tell you what it is. It's a pattern that develops in your life. And so what happens sometimes is we kind of get, and we all make mistakes. Thank God for grace and forgiveness. But he's talking about a trap where somehow our mistakes lead us into a practice, which then leads us into a pattern that then somehow enslaves us. And here's how this works sometimes, is we'll decide, well, I'll just do this once and it'll be just fine. Well, I'll do it one more time. It won't hurt that much. A third time, and then the next thing we know, it's that slippery slope and we can't stop. Or we have hidden sin. And isn't it funny how we don't count the sins no one knows about? You know, what type of deception is that? And we think, well, if no one knows about it, it's not that big deal. I'm dealing with it. And here's what happens, though. When you hide your sin, it turns into a breeding ground for it to grow. Or sometimes it's bitterness and unforgiveness. And it's bitterness or unforgiveness that creates a wound. And I'm sure that you may be one of the people that have experienced this, or you may know someone, but I've walked into people that are holding on to things that have hurt them that happened 25 years ago. And it's become a prison for them that they can't let go of. Or maybe it's just lust and fantasy, and some people get caught up and what you live out in your mind. Don't for 1 second think that it's okay if you just keep it in your mind. No, that's where sin starts. It starts inside, James says, and then it festers and it comes out on the outside. And so if you get involved in lust and fantasy, you already walked into sin. The consequences are still to come, but you're already there. Don't think for 1 second that's not going to affect your life. Or sometimes it's just addictions, whether it's alcohol or drugs or food or TV or phones, and we just lose ourselves in them and we quit living. Or it could be approval seeking, or pride and self-reliance, and we refuse correction and we harden our heart, or greed and materialism, or anger that keeps happening. We can't control it anymore. Or it can be just spiritual neglect, where we just drift away from God, and the more we drift away from God, the more comfortable or right that it seems. And so it's easy, once you develop a practice of sin, to become enslaved in it. And look at what happened to this woman. I mean, she's lucky she was in the Roman Empire. If it had been earlier, they would have stoned her. But can you imagine the shame she felt? And that's what happens, by the way. When sin enslaves you, you're just counting the days. Someday it's going to be exposed. All things come out into the open eventually. And her life here, her self-respect is destroyed. She has no peace left. Now, interestingly, though, Jesus says this to her in verse 10. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Well, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" And she said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Well, neither do I condemn you." Now, here's part of the good thing about this story. Part of the good thing about this story is that God doesn't really want to condemn us. The sin is the problem. We end up putting confidence in false areas, and then it traps us, but God wants to free us from sin. Listen to what Jesus says, or what John says in John chapter 3, verse 16 through 17.
For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn this world, but in order that the world might be saved through him.
Jesus came to save us, not to condemn us. Now, here's the reality, and we know this, but sometimes we get deceived. What condemns us is sin. What condemns us is a pattern of sin in our life, and that will rise up and create consequences in our life. But Jesus has come to give us freedom, not freedom to do what you want. That's the world's idea of freedom. Freedom is you can just do anything you want. Nobody should be able to judge you as long as it doesn't affect anybody else. But you will be condemned by your own actions. It will be the spiritual consequences of your sin. But instead, you get freedom from the things that control you destroying your life. You get freedom from things so that they won't control you and destroy your life. You get freedom to walk away from the very things that would enslave you. That's what the freedom is about. But we have to realize what that path to freedom is. So in chapter 8, verse 31 through 32, again, he says, "So Jesus said to the Jews who had believed him, 'If you abide in my word, you're truly my disciples. And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free.' They answered," well, we'll just stop right there. You know the truth, and truth will set you free. And then he goes down to verse 36, and it says, "So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed." Now in verse 31, he says, "If you abide in my word, you're going to know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And if the Son sets you free, you're free indeed." Now, there's something really important right here. Who sets you free? The Son sets you free. You don't set yourself free. Some people think if I go through enough of these actual things and I read enough things and do enough things, I'm going to set myself free. Well, let me tell you, there's things that you can read that are going to be a whole lot better for you than other things. There's disciplines you can adopt. They're going to be a whole lot better for you than other disciplines. But true freedom comes from the Son. It comes from Jesus. It doesn't come from you. And then he goes on to say in verse 42, "If God were your Father, you would love me, for I came from God and I am here." So you want to know who your Father is? Well, what do you love? What do you love, or who do you love? Because he says here that if you love God, you'll love Jesus. And that's sort of a love relationship with Jesus. And that's why it's so easy to get caught up in false confidence, because you can spew all the right things, but if you are in love with Jesus, and Jesus isn't somehow freed you from anger and hurt, and if Jesus somehow hasn't given you an indescribable peace no matter what's going on around you, and if you don't love him more than anything else, be careful, because you may be putting your confidence in the wrong place. And then he goes on in verse 47 and he says, "Whoever is of God hears the words of God. The reason why you do not hear them is that you are not of God." So if you're of God, you're going to hear God's voice. Tell you a quick story. Talked to my sister and mother yesterday. I was on my 1-hour walk after my sermon study, and they said that my sister just turned 60, but she's been sort of cheating. She's been a widow since 2018, the end of 2018. She's been going to over 60 widows group for about 3 years, and she finally now actually fits in there. But my mom, she was taking my mom. My mom's been going as well. And so they went Thursday to a lunch with the widows, and they had invited this couple, and I forget her name, but his name is Don Rogers, to come talk to him. And he's a member of the Church of Christ. They attend Westside Church of Christ there. My sister goes regularly, my mom when she can. And Don told this story. Well, Don used to be the manager of the Alfred P. Murrah building in Oklahoma City. And he was in there the day that the bomb went off and killed all those people. And he told this phenomenal story about what happened to him and how he got out. And so I thought, well, I'm Mr. Investigator, so I thought, well, I'm going to go look that up. And I looked and looked, and finally I found something. And I found on the University of Rochester Medical Center website, I found an article written by a lady who escaped, and she tells how she escaped, and they used this article to help train their medical students on how to respond to trauma. You read her experience, and then they ask the medical students all these questions. And so I want to read to you just a couple excerpts here. The lights went out. This is from Dot Hill. And I heard a loud boom. My body swelled, and all the air was forced from my lungs. And almost immediately, the ceiling started falling in on top of me, and dust was in the air. I thought the TV had blown up, or the air conditioning, or something had fallen through the roof. And then I thought a bomb went off, and I thought I was going to die. And all these thoughts went through my mind simultaneously. And dirt particles and God only knows what else filled my eyes, nose, and mouth as I tried to breathe, making me choke. And I'm extremely claustrophobic and knew that I would die, if not from suffocation, then trying to fight for air. Just as I began to panic, I heard a young lady who'd been cleaning our break room screaming for help. And she just kept screaming, and I tripped over stuff on the floor and over the recycle bin I'd placed on the floor and over my own fear to find her. Finally, I reached her and told her it would be okay, and I grabbed her hand, and we inched our way along the granite wall, tripping over debris, and tried to reach GSA's front door. We were still suffocating. We could not see more than 1/1,000,000th of an inch in front of our face. We were blind. We had to keep our eyes closed, and we were wondering if we were going to die from asphyxiation. And so I read the rest of the story. I'm going to tell you what it is. So here they are groping their way to the front entrance to get out. And the girl next to her is still screaming. And all of a sudden, they heard a voice. And it was Don Rogers. They mentioned his name. The same person my mom went out to lunch with and my sister on Thursday. And she tells the same story Don did. And she said, I heard this voice, and Don came, and he was with another man, and Don was the manager of the building. And he grabbed my hand and asked if we were okay. And she said, yes, we're okay. What are you doing? We're getting to the front entrance. And he says, no, you can't go that way. You need to go with me to a side entrance. And she argued with him. And she said, no, we're going out the front entrance. And he says, trust me, there's not a front entrance anymore. You need to go with me to the side entrance. And he won the argument, and he grabbed her hand, and his friend grabbed the other lady's hand, and they took him out. And Don, by the way, went to the hospital, got treated, came back to the building, and helped identify bodies. And this is the person my mom had lunch with. Thank God she listened to him. And she says he saved her life. She was going the wrong direction. And if Don Rogers hadn't showed up, it would have been all over for her. Well, I want you to know something. Without God, you're going to go the wrong direction. In the middle of the rubble and the darkness of sin and the pollution from sin, you're not going to find your way out. You're not going to find the life that you want to find. I love this. Everybody, it's a saying, right? Living the dream. Well, let me tell you, there's no living the right dream without Jesus. He's the only answer to life. And he says here that what does he say? He says, whoever is of God hears the words of God. If you want life, if you want to escape the trap of sin, if you want to do that, don't put your confidence in false freedom. Put your confidence in the only place that offers eternal hope, Jesus Christ. And listen to him. You've got to hear him on a daily basis, on a weekly basis. He has to be the one you love. And when you find him, don't let go of his hand, but be willing to surrender to Jesus, because Jesus is the answer to the sin problem. He's the path out of the sin trap, the path to freedom, the only freedom that is real. Let's stand and sing.